The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We'll often do stories about promising cancer treatments, an upcoming cure for a particular type of cancer, or a medication that worked really well in a small trial and was about to enter the next phase of clinical trials for FDA approval. Whatever happens to those, Lewis often says, we will never hear about this again. And that is actually often true. And now researchers have quantified how often the sort of baseless overhype occurs. And it's actually pretty common. As Vox writes, a group of American cancer researchers writing in this week's issue of the JAMA Oncology Journal measured how often 10 superlatives were used to describe cancer drugs in the press. This includes words like breakthrough, game changer, miracle, cure, home run, revolutionary, transformative, lifesaver, etc. Groundbreaking and marvel, I think, were the other two. They searched Google News to see when the phrases were used in connection with cancer drugs, and then they followed up to see if those drugs were ultimately approved. In half the cases, these terms were used to describe medicines that weren't even yet approved by regulators. So not only were they not available to patients, they hadn't even passed FDA scrutiny yet. And even worse, 14% of the time that those superlative terms were used, the drugs had no human data behind them at all, which means that sometimes the term miracle or cure was used about something that had only been tested on mice or maybe even just cell cultures. So who do we blame for the overhype? Vox says, and as Vox writes, the journal says that the terms are often deployed by journalists, but not always, that in 30% of the cases, it's the doctors themselves who use language like, oh, this is a miracle, or this is a game changer about a new cancer drug. What we try to do on this show is report on not only new possibilities that are a little more advanced in terms of the trials that have been done, but we try to talk about, more broadly speaking, what's on the horizon with cancer treatment. And for example, we recently interviewed Dr. Lance Leota, who said there is really no such thing as a singular cancer treatment or cure, and there likely won't be. We're going in the direction of different treatments and different possible cures for not only different types of cancers, but as Dr. Leota said, individualized treatments or individualized therapy, even for the same cancers in different people. Lots of promise right now with the individualized therapy component, lots of promise with using viruses in different situations to treat different types of cancer. The only sort of general cancer cure that there might be would be, I don't know, genetic editing to give people sort of like do error correction in their bodies so that cancer is less likely to develop. And even that would probably be, for different types of cancers, maybe different types of genetic editing if that were ever to become possible. So I think it's important not only to remember that we should look at how far in the trial process new medications may be, but also to remember that a cure for cancer is probably not going to be a thing. We're talking about different cures and different applications for different cancers and different people. And I would encourage you to go and check out that interview with Dr. Lance Leota for more information about this. This is fantastic news that I have for you. Britain's first ever pedestrian fast and slow lanes have opened in the city center of Liverpool, following research which says 47% of England finds slow walking the most annoying aspect of shopping out on the street. This is starting on St. John Street. Fast walking lanes will allow users to speed through the crowds while looking at the different stores that are there in the Liverpool One shopping center, I guess. And the research was conducted by Argos, and it revealed that shoppers hate battling through crowds. They hate people chatting in the middle of the street. They don't like the pavement hoggers, etc. And the idea of fast lanes is far more appealing to young shoppers than to old shoppers. Almost 70% of those 16 to 24 said they like the idea of a walking fast lane. Only 37% of those over age 55 like the shopping fast lane. I absolutely love this. I generally walk, I guess, pretty fast, and I'll be sort of weaving through people, but somehow I always end up behind someone who just can't walk straight ahead. They're sort of angling to one side, and I'll initially think I'll get around them on one side, and as I approach them and the angles start to cut, I'll think of going around them the other side, and it becomes impossible, and I end up taking like these baby steps right behind them, unable to get around. They're oblivious to the fact that I'm there, and it's really very annoying. And in New York and Boston, it's a little bit less of a problem since people just generally tend to walk faster, but also those cities have a lot of tourists. And I once witnessed in New York City 2 tourists standing not just on the side of the sidewalk, not just in the middle of the sidewalk, not just in a subway station off to the side, rather on the staircase exiting a subway station, blocking the entire stairway. If you consider how many people every minute are walking up and down those stairs, you can quickly imagine the screaming that ensued after 10 seconds of these tourists blocking the staircase exiting the subway. And the most amazing part is that the 2 tourists never noticed that the crowd of 20, 30 people that was building were all yelling at them, ultimately just deciding to get off the stairs and go about their tourist ways. And I like living in cities with tourists because it does add so much, but the walking is so annoying. And one strategy I've worked on that works a little bit is as you're approaching, make sure that your feet make some noise. So I'll sometimes like drag my shoe on the pavement and it'll make a noise. So the person in front of me will turn, realize there's someone coming, and usually make a clear move to one side or the other to let you pass. You can also cough. That's another way that you can make someone aware that you're coming up behind them and avoid the sort of, there should be a name for it, like the baby step scuffle. I don't know really, shuffle maybe is a better term. I don't know what to call it, but yes, I love this idea, and I think it would be great to have in American cities. Of course, older cities like Boston and New York have such narrow sidewalks in many neighborhoods that I don't know that there's even room for that, but not that Liverpool is that new of a city either, and it seems that they're able to figure it out. I love it. Send me your tips for getting around slow walkers on the sidewalk. Okay, the Hatriot Mail calendars for 2016 are available, and they are starting to go out. You can get yours at davidpakman.com/calendar16. I still don't have mine yet. I'll remind you, this is that I'm holding up for our TV audience. This is the 2015 Hatriot Mail calendar, and every page has a different custom image created by a David Pakman Show viewer related to Hatriot Mail. This is a really good conversation piece. People tell me that they have the 2015 calendar in their office or on their cubicle wall, and that it creates many interesting conversations, a lot of funny stories from coworkers and that type of thing. In 2015, we shipped 122 of these calendars. My goal for the 2016 calendar is to ship out 200 of them. After day 1, we had 9 calendars ordered. So we are well on our way, given that we just started selling these. You can get a calendar autographed or not autographed. And option number 2 is you can get the calendar for free with a yearly membership. But there's only one website where you can do all of this, and that's at davidpakman.com/calendar16. Get just the calendar or get the calendar for free with a yearly membership, and then you'll get the bonus show and the commercial-free audio feed and the commercial-free video feed, and you'll be invited to next month's town hall meeting with Lewis and with me, where you can ask us questions in a private video conference just with our membership base, and you get the calendar for free. So you really can't go wrong with that. davidpakman.com/calendar16. Today may well be the last David Pakman Show before we move the studio to Boston, Massachusetts. Every indication, as far as I am aware of right now, which is very, I know I'm creating all sorts of disclaimers. To the best of my knowledge, as of this exact second, we will be moving to the new studio over the weekend, and as a result, we will probably have a couple of days off at the beginning of next week to get that new studio set up. Once Lewis returns from his trip and we get the whole thing going, I will talk about it more on the bonus show today, which if you were a member, you'd be able to get all the details about. So I recommend signing up and get yourself the free calendar. davidpakman.com/calendar16. We have great audience questions to answer today and so much other great stuff happening on this Friday show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Our program is made possible mostly by our audience through the David Pakman Show membership program. Today's new member of the day is Julie Frazier. Julie, thank you so much for subscribing. It really is the number one funding source for our show. And you can sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. And we have started sales of the 2016 Hatriot Mail calendar. I will send you a free calendar, which retails for $25 if you sign up for a yearly membership, but you have to do it at davidpakman.com/calendar16. Free calendar with a yearly membership. If you want just the calendar, you can get that as well at davidpakman.com/calendar16 before supplies run out. Love saying that. I don't know if they will run out, but it certainly would be interesting. davidpakman.com/calendar16. 5 years ago this week, Keith Olbermann was suspended from MSNBC. We talked then about the suspension, the donations the political donations he made without pre-clearing them with MSNBC executives, his ultimate demise at MSNBC, and all of the factors at play, including the Comcast purchase of MSNBC and so many other things. And what I still remember from that entire incident is the absurd double standard that exists, not necessarily at MSNBC. MSNBC had this policy and they were doing what they were doing, but the hypocrisy, or rather the lack of standards that some of the other networks have. I mean, Fox News regularly has their on-air talent participating in all sorts of Republican events, all sorts of interest group events, etc. And it's just sort of part of the MO, the standard operating procedure over there. And Keith Olbermann here failed to pre-clear and report these relatively small donations that he made. Now, I don't make political donations, and I really want to be able to say that what I say on air is sort of the full extent of my involvement with a particular candidate or organization. So I do not make any political donations. My political support of candidates comes on the show. And if I haven't said that I've endorsed someone, or if I haven't said I'm voting for a particular person, then there are no financial donations that you can track down because I simply do not make them. And I also try to go out of my way when it's reasonable to mention if there's any other financial connection that I have. So I own some shares of Tesla, the American automaker. It's a company that I believe will do well. I try whenever I remember, and I think most of the time I successfully do this, mention when we do a story about Tesla that in the interest of full disclosure, I own some shares of Tesla. Now, I really don't own shares of very many companies directly, but I do, when I have some extra money, put it into a retirement account, which holds mutual funds. And the mutual funds are very broad. One is called the Total Stock Market Index, which presumably tracks the entire market, the entire stock market of the US. There is no doubt that in those mutual funds, there are probably oil companies, there are pharmaceutical companies, there are all sorts of companies, and that gets a little tough to track. We're talking about thousands and thousands of companies. But to the extent that I am aware, I try to make any financial conflicts or I wouldn't call them conflicts, but entanglements known. And Keith Olbermann was not trying to hide this, and he ultimately paid a really big price, losing his spot at MSNBC. Meanwhile, we see such atrocious, vile, and nauseating financial conflicts of interest among so many others in our media. sort of feel bad for Keith Olbermann, no question about that. 4 years ago this week, an early snowstorm in the Northeast, we call it the Halloween ice storm, knocked out my power. It knocked out Lewis's power. It knocked out the studio power that we had at the time. And we ended up missing a show. And it was an utter disaster. And I was on Facebook the other day and I saw a forecast saying Halloween ice storm predicted. And I said, this can't be happening again. And I clicked it and it was actually people posting the forecast from that Halloween day 4 years ago. And I remember it was still quite warm even in Massachusetts. Storms that early, snowstorms that early are pretty rare. And I remember hearing, oh, it's going to be a couple of inches. Great, not going to be a big deal. And as the snow started, it was the heavy, slushy, wet snow that you see when it is still a little bit warm out. And the trees still had leaves on them, and you could immediately see the heavy snow on the branches that still had leaves, and everything was just hanging down, and it did not look good. And within a few hours, the power to so much of Western Massachusetts, of Northern Connecticut, of so many areas was out. And I remember that night coming home, and I found out that if you light enough candles, you can actually raise the temperature. My place at the time had electric heat, so I had no heat. Lighting candles could actually raise the temperature in the room a little bit. So I had a bunch of these tiny little, I think they're called tea candles. And I lit a bunch of them and was able to fall asleep amidst the candles with like 5 blankets and 2 pairs of pants on. And I did keep waking up worried about whether I was going to burn my house down. Fortunately, that didn't happen. And the power just did not come back to a lot of areas for several days. And it was not good. And the other thing that stands out to me is how much we take for granted modern conveniences and electricity. And immediately when all of a sudden there was no hot water and there was no heat, and because everything in my place at the time was electric, I couldn't cook anything. And I had to be very careful with my mobile phone because I could go out to the car to charge it using my car charger, but I needed to be careful of that because it was really hard to get gas at the time. A lot of gas stations were totally shut down because they had no electricity. Very quickly, you see how precarious our state of affairs is. And this is where the preppers actually sort of get my attention. I don't really believe in the Mormon food storage, storing a year worth of food, or buying, as a lot of those crazy right-wing shows promote, 500 servings of buckwheat or whatever it is. But when you have a power outage and you quickly start to see you've got to run on gasoline, you can barely even keep your mobile phone charged, which becomes one of your only outlets to get a hold of the outside world in many cases. You don't have heat. You can't prepare food. It can get crazy pretty quickly. So when I think back to that, I do think I need to be more prepared. And sadly, I can't say that I am. I don't think I'm any more prepared for an extended power outage today than I was 4 years ago when we had that crazy storm. I probably need to get on that. 3 years ago this week, President Barack Obama won re-election with over 300 electoral votes. I was reviewing some of our notes from 3 years ago, and I was reminded of how confident the Romney campaign was. And ultimately, when I watched that Netflix documentary, Mitt, it's on Netflix, although it wasn't produced by Netflix, about Mitt Romney's campaign, he really believed those internal Republican polls that said, you've got this thing in the bag, you're going to win. He was really stunned when he not only lost to President Obama, but was absolutely crushed by President Obama. And not to pat myself on the back, because a lot of people had this right, my election prediction map was 100% accurate. And the reason I say not to pat myself on the back is all I did was look at an average of polls in each state and say, okay, in an average of polls, not only looking at the Republican polls, it looks like President Obama is going to win this particular state, and I would fill that state in blue on my map. And that was all it took. In other words, I didn't do anything crazy. I didn't have any lucky guesses. I merely went with the average of state polls, and I was 100% right in my election prediction. So it really just showed you the sort of insular and disconnected nature of the Romney administration back then. Now, as far as President Obama's second term is concerned, I think that within the boundaries of what we can realistically expect presidents to accomplish in a term, President Obama has done many good things. At the same time, we have been huge critics of President Obama when it comes to the things he has not been good on. This comes to the expansion of many of the ineffective surveillance techniques that were started under the Bush administration. This comes to everything dating back, many things dating back to the very beginning of President Obama's first term, closing Guantanamo Bay. This comes to the lack of prosecution of the Wall Street bankers who were very involved in destroying the economy. Although it didn't happen under President Obama, the lack of prosecution certainly did. And we could go on and on. This particular segment isn't about criticizing President Obama. We do plenty of that, but sort of contextualizing that for the pluses and minuses we can attribute to President Obama, much of what goes on during a president's presidency is not directly attributable to them. And in addition to that, let's not forget that a Romney administration would have been an utter abortion, and we should all be very much glad that ultimately that didn't happen. And now, as we get into the 2016 election more, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking of, yeah, I have disagreements with Hillary Clinton. There are differences between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton that, as political observers and as voters and engaged citizens, we should be thinking about and talking about. But in the end, what we all should want to avoid, if we are rational, clear-thinking people, is for a second thinking that any of the Republican candidates would be even remotely reasonable compared to any of the remaining Democratic candidates. Let's not miss the forest for the trees, please.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Bernie Sanders, running for president in the Democratic primary for 2016, has brought out the discussion of socialism and Bernie Sanders' democratic socialism. So for today's classic interview, we're going to go back to June 26th of 2012. This was when I interviewed Steve Siebold. He wanted to come on and talk about how delusional thinking is destroying America. And it just so happens that what he thought was destroying America was socialism, including the socialist nature of the Affordable Care Act. Now, needless to say, we did not see eye to eye, as you might imagine, and we're going to revisit that conversation today. This goes back to June 26th of 2012 when I interviewed Steve Siebold. Let's think about the absurdity of calling the Affordable Care Act socialist, and the absurdity of this entire conversation, really, in context now with Bernie Sanders, his democratic socialist ideas, and the increased acceptance for those ideas. Joining me is Steve Siebold, author of Sex, Politics, Religion, How Delusional Thinking is Destroying America. Steve, great to have you. You make the case in the book that a lack of just basic critical thinking about some of the foremost political issues is really driving us in the wrong direction, particularly with the politicization of a lot of these issues. Let's go through a couple of these one by one if we can, and just kind of see where you think the critical thinking direction will get us on these. I want to start with healthcare reform, which we're actually awaiting a Supreme Court decision on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, the idea here is that the delusional thinking is we actually have the money to pay for this crazy law, and we don't. Obviously, we're broke, and to have 32 million people uninsured and then insure everyone in the country, force everyone to be insured to cover these 32 million, many of which are really young people, is ridiculous. I mean, and even if it wasn't ridiculous, we don't have the money. We're broke. And we're going to bankrupt our grandkids with this kind of thing. Hopefully the Supreme Court will come back and rule against it.
See, I can understand why individually you would come to some of those conclusions, but the problem is, okay, let's take a look at the insuring young people thing. If we don't insure young people when they're healthy, then they're not going to be able to get insurance from health insurance companies once they do get sick, and inevitably people do get sick. So if that is your point of view, do you believe we should just have a national government healthcare system like they do in many countries in Europe, or are you going the other way, kind of the Republican way of saying we should have a completely free market-based system?
Absolutely, free market-based system, more of a libertarian point of view, I think, than even Republican. But yeah, definitely more toward that. And if we're gonna hit the 32 million, let's hit the 32 million instead of 332 million. I mean, it makes no sense. Even if we could afford it, it's obviously socialized medicine, and it just really reflects the views of the Obama administration. I mean, it's obviously a socialist leaning, at least, organization or administration. I mean.
So but you said we're putting 32 million people into the for-profit healthcare system, which is mostly the result of corporate funding and corporate influence. What's socialist about that?
Well, I think the biggest issue here is that nobody. This is one of the delusions that I talk about in the book. Is that no one in this country is denied health care. They never have been denied health care. They never will be. If you walk into a hospital off the street and you have no money, you will be treated.
No, that's not true. Well, hold on a second. Let's think critically, because I know that that's your thing. There are laws indicating that the patient has to be stabilized. Okay, that's legally all that has to happen. That doesn't mean that you are going to get cancer treatment, for example. It just means legally the hospital has to stabilize you and or transfer you somewhere where you can be stabilized. But that doesn't mean that you're going to get treatment. But I want to go back to what you said. What's socialist about putting 32 million people at the mercy of for-profit health insurance companies, an additional 32 million people?
Well, it's socialist if it's welfare. I mean, if it's socialized medicine, it's socialist. I mean, it's a socialist philosophy or policy.
But Steve, hold on a second. You're the critical thinking guy. You're defining something as socialist by saying it's socialized medicine. You can't define something. The definition for something can't be that which we are defining. What is socialist about putting 32 million people into the for-profit healthcare system and letting companies with profit as their motive decide whether they should or shouldn't have treatments approved, co-pays, etc.? What's socialist about that?
Well, that's not. You're going the other way. If you're putting them into the system we have currently, it's not, and that's where they are now.
That's what we're doing.
Well, no, but if Obamacare is going to mandate, I mean, they're going to have to buy insurance. I mean,
yes, for-profit insurance from the for-profit companies. What's socialist about that?
It's socialist because it's mandated. It's mandated by the government. That's socialist by definition. I mean, it's mandated by the government. You are forced to buy a product, and it's unconstitutional.
So the Republicans who first came up with the individual mandate idea in the early 90s, they're socialist.
Well, that's a sweeping generalization. I wouldn't go that far, but I mean, I think.
But Obama's socialist when he does it.
Well, no. I think I'm not saying they're socialists. I'm saying they're socialists.
Did say that, Steve. That's the thing. I have a problem with the socialism claims because many people like to say this is socialist, and when you ask them about it, they do what you're doing. They say socialism is socialist, or they equivocate. So when I'm thinking critically about it, I have a real problem with it.
Well, yeah. Okay. Let me explain. Okay.
Let's back up. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. We have socialized medicine in this country, and Medicaid is socialized medicine. Medicare is partially socialized medicine. I mean,
correct.
Social Security is a socialist program. It's welfare. It's not welfare, but it's government. It's government funded to some degree.
You pay into it, and then you get money back.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, it's not like we're not totally doing this. What I'm saying is that for the government to come along and mandate that we buy a product, that's so. I'm not saying Obama or the administration they're socialists.
Oh, you're not saying that because I could have sworn you did.
They're leaning. I said social. They're leaning toward a socialist philosophy. I mean, you could. Okay. That's a pretty big statement to make that they're socialists, but I think
it was. I was surprised you made it. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, I said leaning. I think I said leaning. I think they lean toward that.
Okay.
But Obamacare, to me, is a completely socialist program. I mean, it's a government mandate of a product. It's un-American. It's unconstitutional. And I think David, when I think by Thursday we're going to get a decision by the Supreme Court, and I think they're going to go against it. I'm pretty sure. I don't know how they can't.
Yeah. Because I want to get to other topics, we'll agree to kind of drop it. But again, I would go back to the same question. What's socialist about putting 32 million more people into a for-profit health insurance mandated by corporations? Let's talk about gay marriage. What's our critical thinking analysis of gay marriage?
Well, that it's not discrimination to keep gays from being, from allowing them to to be married, and it's not, it's obviously a religious thing. It's from the religious right. They've been going after people. I mean, they've discriminated against almost every group. I mean, women. I mean, the religious right has gone against women. They've gone against minorities. They've gone. I mean, it's just ridiculous, and gay marriage is gonna be passed in this country, Dave. There's no question, because it's the right thing to do. It's just a matter of time. All these Bible thumpers are gonna lose eventually because it's wrong. It's outdated. It's antiquated. They need to grow up emotionally and let people be who they want to be.
See, Steve, I was surprised about our disagreement on healthcare reform because you're so spot on with the gay marriage issue. I mean, there's no question, inevitably, this is a fight that's going to be lost. And it is, you're right, being directed mostly by the religious right. Since we agree on that one, let me fit one more topic in. Death penalty. Give me your thoughts.
Well, I think the death penalty is a really controversial issue. I really think, I mean, there are studies that show that it's not really effective. I mean, there are really some conflicting studies on this. I struggled with this one in the book, honestly. I think that the death penalty should be enforced, and we should have it. But at the same time, a lot of studies show that it's not really effective in deterring crime. So that's really a tough one. I'm not against the death penalty, but I think that, again, it's more of the religious right infringing on policy, on public policy.
So you believe that it's perfectly legitimate for the state to sanction the killing of people based on a list of crimes the state itself has determined to be worthy enough of death as the punishment? You believe the state?
Yeah.
But I thought you were very libertarian.
Well, it's a tough one. It's a tough issue. I've really studied a lot, and it's a tough one. But yeah, I think so, because I think it does determine people. I mean, deter people. I mean, to from committing capital offenses, and although some studies show against it, it's a tough one.
Because at the beginning you said you don't think that it's a very good deterrent. I mean, what about the fact that, forget about whether, let's skip whether the state should have the right to make those decisions about taking life from others. What about the fact that, like, for example, we just found out that in Texas an innocent man was put to death? What about the finality of it, the lack of being able to provide someone remuneration for wrong imprisonment or incorrect punishment? Once you kill them, you can't do that.
Yeah, I know, and a lot of people make that case, and I think that there have been very few cases that have turned out that way. I mean, of all the people that have been put to death, I mean, I don't think there have been too many mistakes, but you're right. I mean, even if there's a mistake made on one person, that is one of the issues. I don't think that should hold us back. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but I think that's reality.
All right, one out of three is not bad, I guess, on the three topics we got to. The book is Sex, Politics, Religion. It's by Steve Siebold. Even if we don't agree, I thought the book was very compelling and an interesting read. So thanks for being on today.
Hey, thanks, David. I appreciate it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's time for this week's audience questions. Questions this week from Sasha, Garrett, and Ray. Submit questions via email, via Twitter. I'm on Twitter at dpakman. You can go on our Reddit discussion forum at davidpakman.com/Reddit. You can call our voicemail number, 219-2DavidP. Whatever works for you. Get us your audience questions and we will answer them. First question is from Sasha. David, why is art often not censored on TV or elsewhere, even when nudity and swearing in movies and TV shows is? This is a fantastic question. I have always wondered why, when you see on some channels, you see that you can't swear and you can't have nudity, etc. A piece of art is shown that may contain nudity, and that's considered okay. What is the line between the types of art where you have to censor the nudity and the types of art where you don't? Now, what's hilarious about this is that sometimes, and I recall this happening, I think it was on Fox News a few months ago, Fox News, in their puritanical ways, decided to blur, I don't remember if it was a Picasso painting or some painting, and it was hilarious because I mean, on the one hand, I guess they were at least being consistent, right? They said, hey, if we don't have nudity here because the so-called moral majority groups, the religious right, would flip out, we'll blur it when it's on a painting as well. As stupid as I think it is, at least they were consistent. But usually you see the double standard, which is the video on the TV shows, the live action nudity has to be censored. Even cartoon nudity has to be censored. But when it comes to art, it doesn't have to be. I think it is a total double standard. And I've talked about this before. Children's lives are not ruined by hearing an expletive here or there, or by seeing a breast here or there, taking me back now more than 10 years to when Janet Jackson's breast was exposed during her performance at a Super Bowl halftime ceremony. No, we now have a lot of little kids who are teenagers or older. None of their lives were ruined. None of their moral compasses were destroyed by seeing Janet Jackson's breast over a decade ago. And this is really one of those areas where I think the so-called moral majority is just flat out wrong. And there are still right-wingers who are upset with President Obama for not focusing enough on TV, nudity, and swearing and obscenity. I have many critiques of President Obama, and there are other areas where I think President Obama has done a good job. I think it is fantastic that he has not focused on media nudity and indecency and obscenity, because it is not what we should be focused on. And in countless other countries, including my home country of Argentina, there's swearing on regular television. There's nudity, not extreme hardcore sex scenes, but there's nudity on regular television, and it's just not a big deal. It really is no big deal, and it is the last thing that so-called small governments should be dealing with, and I'm glad President Obama is essentially ignoring the issue. Garrett wrote to me. Garrett said, kind of a funny question, are truffles worth the exorbitant cost? Truffles are these, there's, I don't even know if it's actually a type of mushroom, but it's mushroom-like. They are only found in very specific conditions. They're used to flavor foods. They're used to flavor cheeses. They're used in cooking, and they are very, very pricey. Truffle oil and truffles are just generally very expensive. Now, are they worth the exorbitant cost? I like a little truffle in some items here or there, but I find that anything more than the smallest amount of truffle oil or of truffles in a dish makes the flavor overpowering. So to the extent that I think you only need a tiny, tiny amount of truffle to flavor something, I guess you could say they're worth the cost, because the tiny amount I think makes sense or is palatable is not going to be very expensive. Now, that being said, I have been to some friends' houses who are just loading everything with truffles. They've got truffle cheese for their crackers, and then they make truffle mac and cheese, and then they've got pasta that has truffle in it. I would say it is not worth the exorbitant cost to put truffle in every single dish that you're serving, because quite frankly, it can be a little bit overpowering. So I don't know how serious this question was. I don't know how decided our audience is on the issue of including truffles in food, but I think that a little truffle here and there isn't bad. But no, I don't think they are worth the exorbitant cost if the idea is just to fill your foods with truffle flavoring. I think it can be a little bit, I guess, cloying would be the right word to describe what can happen if you are over truffling your food. I don't know where Garrett stands on this. Hopefully I haven't offended anybody. Last question today is from Ray. Ray says, couldn't we resolve some or many of the problems brought on by systems of currency if we went back to the barter system? There are huge problems with the barter system for a modern society like that which we have in the United States and in so many countries around the world. First of all is that people are generally working at an employer. So if you're going to barter for your labor, first of all, your employer would need to figure out how to give you all of the different things that you would need. Otherwise, it's very complicated. If your employer says, okay, here we're bartering all of your work for rice, And then you have to then take rice and exchange it for all of the different things you might want. That really might not work. And then the other issue is that the barter system would require sort of a general consensus as to how much a person's time is worth based on their skills. And then you also need to take into consideration as an employer the costs associated with the acquisition of the good which you provide in the barter for people's labor. You can very quickly see how it would get very, very complex. And then the other problem with going back to barter in a modern society like the one which we have in the United States is that for all of the problems that exist with money, right, which can be the inflationary and deflationary aspect of it, the ability for the Fed to print money that is not necessarily backed by real economic production, right? We understand all that. The great thing about money is that it is fungible, right? You have a central currency that can be exchanged for any number of goods and services. And if you eliminate that, you are changing the sort of ubiquity and fungibility of money. And then you have different goods which may trade with other items at different scales based on supply and demand, etc. Now, at the same time, when we think about how the value of money can change, you could say, well, listen, David, yeah, the value of rice as a unit of barter probably would also change in the same way that the value of money can change. But it's a drastically different situation. Money, the value of money fluctuates based on exchange rates and other factors, but it doesn't vary based on whether it's summer or winter, right? And heating oil as an item of barter, for example, would change drastically based on where in the season we are in places that get cold. So it presents a whole new set of challenges. So I think the answer here, Ray, is absolutely not. While it might appear as though we could resolve some currency issues if we were to go back to a barter system, it would bring on such a plethora of new issues that it absolutely does not make sense for modern societies. Will we see changes to what we consider the currency status quo in the United States over the next 50 or 100 years? We may well, particularly with the elimination of cash that is already happening in many modern countries. We may well see a very significant realignment of our relationship to currency. But going back to the barter system is not what I see as the solution. We have a terrific bonus show for you today. Make sure to sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. We will talk to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.